Do you like true crime? Do you like bad fake tan? Well, you've come to the right place. Just a wee minute, guys. Apparently one of my neighbours feels like our cul-de-sac is a Formula 1 racetrack, so we'll just wait until he's finished. Give it a rest. You're driving a Peugeot. Hey there guys, my name's Megan if you're new here, and if not, welcome back for another spooky episode of Killer Weekend, where each week we'll discuss a true crime case and you guys can feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments box below. She's a maniac. If you like all things true crime, supernatural, UFO, conspiracy theory, and all that good stuff in between, then please hit that subscribe button. I'll be here for you each week with our true crime killer weekends, and on and off every couple of Wednesdays with our Weirdo Wednesdays, where we'll discuss something spooky I've heard. If you'd like to further support this wee channel of mine, then please feel free to visit www.patreon.com/Megan TrueCrime. To all my Patreons out there, I know, I have been a little bit absent, but I promise you, I have a lot of good videos coming your way. I promise as of next week, you'll be sick of me. Or, if you're like some of the bullies in the comments section, you'll be sick of me within the first 2 minutes of this video.
Just keep it inside and learn how to hide your feelings.
Please also remember that we have a new true crime Reddit spooky stories section. So if you guys have any true crime near misses, if you have any ghost stories, any scary stories at all, send them over to me at megankillerweekend@gmail.com. Hey there my wee gremlins, how are y'all? I hope you're all doing well, and I just wanted to say a massive thank you for all of your love on my previous video, the Noah Donahoe case. I really want to get the case out there in the media and get justice for Fiona Donahoe. What's been going on in your side of town? Has anyone not been keeping up with the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial drama? All my people out there, just remember the next time your significant other's being really irritating, at least they didn't take a shit on your bed. Possibly even worse than that, she blamed it on the dog. Now, I'm gonna be upfront, okay? My fiance definitely prefers our Chihuahua to me. Okay, I'm just gonna put it out there, but I handle it, okay? I don't go and take a pee-pee in his Nikes. If you guys know me over here at Megan TrueCrime, you will know I'm a 90-year-old woman stuck in a 20-year-old plus 10 years body, and I love all things Agatha Christie. I don't know what it is. Poirot, Miss Marple, maybe it's the moustache. But one of my favourite stories has to be the murder on the Orient Express. I don't know what it is about this group of strangers meeting in an old-fashioned train, but one of them has a deadly secret. Next thing you know, the train's going through a dark tunnel and all the lights go off. But when the lights come back on again, it's a dead body in the middle of the room. But the murderer remains a mystery. In real life, trains have become part of our everyday routine, with some commuting twice a day since the invention of the railway in 1804. None of us really seem to actually think about the hundreds of faceless strangers that you walk by on that busy train platform. In such crowded places, we feel safe. Safety in numbers, as they say, but we really have no clue just who we may encounter on a daily basis. I recently read a study which said that the average US citizen, if they live to the age of 75, will walk by 10 unapprehended murderers in their lifetime. What? Yes, boys and girls, and if that little fun fact doesn't make you second guess your entire life, well, this next case definitely will. Tonight, everyone, we will be discussing the brutal murder of Debbie Linsley, the girl on the train. Growing up in Scotland in the early 90s, could be rough at times, but we had one beautiful tradition. You see, here in Scotland, children begin school at around 4 or 5 years old, and this is when they enter primary 1. At the age of 11-12, we then leave school in primary 7. So it's become kind of a rite of passage that the primary 7s terrify the new students on their first day at school. Normally it's with a little old wives' tale or an urban legend, but a personal favourite in my school playground was The Girl on the Train. I'll set the scene for you guys. It's late on a Saturday night in Glasgow, of course, and a group of drunk women board the last train of the evening. Now they're all giggling and having fun, talking about who fancies who, when they notice a woman sitting directly across from them, staring straight ahead. It becomes kind of awkward and they begin to look at each other as the woman does not break their gaze. They think that maybe she's feeling unwell as she's looking a little bit pale, and that perhaps she's just a rude person who likes to stare. As a train enters the station and one by one the girls begin to alight from the train, one of them takes a look back, and just as the train doors are closing back over again, she notices that the woman is still sitting and still staring. After sleeping off what would have been a very rough hangover from the night before, one of the females wakes up to make herself a coffee and switches on her television when she is shocked by a horrific story: a woman who was found dead on a train. She drops her coffee cup to the ground and it smashes everywhere as the face of this deceased woman is flashed on her screen. There, clear as day, is the photo of the woman who was sitting on the train, and the realisation begins to sink in that she wasn't being rude or feeling queasy, she was dead. Murdered, no less. And just to add a festering cherry to the top of this shit trifle is the fact that the killer, of course, has never been caught. And I know you guys are probably sitting there thinking, Megan, why are you telling us this twisted bedtime story? Well, I've always said on this channel that urban legends and email horror chains usually have some sort of truth behind them, an inspiration, if you will. And I believe that the inspiration for this particular story took place in the 1980s. 1988 exactly, when 26-year-old Debbie Linsley boarded a train heading from Pettswood Station to London Victoria on the 23rd of March. Debbie, a senior receptionist for a popular Edinburgh hotel, was wearing a black leather jacket, a blue jumper and a long blue skirt. She was also sporting your typical 1980s hairdo. Prior to her journey, she'd purchased a pack of cigarettes and had brought along with her a sandwich to eat on the train. You see, back in the 1980s, the kind of risks of smoking weren't as well known, so British citizens were pretty much able to smoke anywhere they wanted. Some trains even had their very own smoking and non-smoking compartments, which would be unheard of today after many successful anti-smoking campaigns. Because of these relaxed rules, Debbie decided to seat herself in a smoker's compartment, the second carriage from the front of the train, somewhere Debbie could have a sandwich and a ciggy in peace. This particular train was comprised of several old school carriages, so if you imagine Harry Potter, the fact that you could only sit 3 people on either side of the carriage and there was only one main door exiting the train. One design feature that this kind of train had that our trains of today don't share is the fact they had closed compartments, which meant you could not travel freely through the carriages. This also meant that if you were on the train and a creeper got on next to you, you had one of 2 options. You could either wait for the train to stop at the next station, get off and get on another carriage, or you could simply tuck and roll and open the door, throwing yourself from a moving train. Because of these obvious safety issues, lone female travellers would avoid these carriages like the plague. Even Debbie herself, whilst on a day out with her mum, had said that these kind of trains gave her the creeps and that she would always avoid them and try and seat herself right behind the conductor's door. But unfortunately, that day she didn't take her own advice, and because she wanted to smoke, she sat in the only smoker's cabin that was available to her, which was a closed carriage. During her 34-minute journey, Debbie smoked at least one of her cigarettes and ate half of her sandwich. Little did the other passengers know that she was also fighting for her life. At 2:50 p.m. that day, the 2:16 London Victoria train pulled into the station. It was quite busy, and these trains are subject to a quick turnaround before taking off on their next journey. At this time, porter Ron Lacey opened up the doors to the second carriage from the front, Debbie's carriage. His life would forever be changed when there, slumped, laying in a pool of blood on the floor, was 26-year-old Debbie Linsley. According to the coroner's report, Debbie had been stabbed 11 times. 5 times were in the chest and around the heart. The rest of those were on her neck, her face, and her abdomen. She had fought her killer to her final moment, which was clear with the extensive wounds she had on her hands and her forearms. When investigators arrived on scene, it became very clear that this was more than just a robbery gone wrong. Debbie had a £5 note in her purse that her brother Gordon had lent her, which was still intact, and also all of her jewellery that she was wearing was still on her body. The scene itself could not determine a motive for this killing. However, the extensive injuries that Debbie had on her chest and her breasts would hint that the killer had a hatred for women, and that perhaps this crime was sexually motivated. This was a brutal crime, even for London standards in the 1980s, and local law enforcement feared that with this kind of frenzied attack, it wasn't the killer's first, and it most certainly would not be his last. More than anything though, law enforcement wanted to get answers for Debbie's family. Deborah Linsley, nicknamed Debbie by those who loved her, was born on October 20th in 1962 in Bromley near Kent. She was the second child to her mother Marguerite and father Arthur, and was very close to her big brother Gordon. Arthur and Marguerite both worked within the insurance industry, he as an insurance broker and Marguerite as an insurance fraud investigator. So basically, the dream team. I actually have a funny fraud story. It's not me, I wasn't the fraudster. Back in my previous life as a jeweller, I had a VIP client who lost her very expensive...
It's very expensive.
It's very expensive.
engagement ring. Well, wouldn't you know that when they started investigating her, it appeared that her ring was a phantom because it was turning up in all of her new Facebook photos. Out to lunch with my friends, with my ring on. At the hairdresser, with my ring on. Skydiving, with my ring on. Safe to say she never got the payout and she was charged with fraud. But in all seriousness, don't do it, guys, and if you are gonna do it, don't post about it online. Megan Mackay's advice for criminals. So yeah, Marguerite and Arthur were crushing it, and because of that, they were able to provide their children with a nice middle-class lifestyle. Debbie and her mum were best pals. They did everything together, shopping trips, days out for lunch. Unlike most teenagers, Marguerite said that Debbie actually blossomed into a lovely young woman and gave her no trouble at all. She was just an outgoing and loving little girl. Whilst many others knew Deborah simply as Debbie, her mum Marguerite had her very own nicknames for her, which were Gorgeous Little Girl and Her Treasure. According to those who loved Debbie, there was never a stranger who met her who didn't instantly warm to her. But she was no naive Nelly. In fact, she would often tell her friends to be more street smart and more aware, something she had learned with her busy weekends travelling into London. Always hyper vigilant, Debbie actually carried a rape whistle which was attached to her house keys on a keyring. Not only this, she would avoid walking anywhere alone at night and was just extremely safety conscious. In this respect, her mum Marguerite felt like her daughter was very ahead of her time. She said she was always very aware of her surroundings, constantly looking over her shoulder before the topic of true crime became popular and made us all paranoid. As close to her family as she was, Debbie couldn't stay home forever, and in her mid-20s she decided to accept a job in Edinburgh as a senior receptionist. She took to the role in Scotland like a duck to water, and pretty soon she had a flatmate and a boyfriend. The 26-year-old impressed other hotel staff with her leadership roles, and pretty soon she was offered a management training course opportunity down south. Debbie readily accepted this because 1, she was excited for the opportunity, and 2, it meant that she could visit her family whilst on the course. So that afternoon, she called her mum and her brother and arrangements were made for her coming back home. Gordon, her older brother, was getting married that same spring, and he had asked Debbie to be a bridesmaid, something she was really excited about. So over the 3 days, it was planned that Debbie would attend a bridal fitting with her future sister-in-law. The upcoming nuptials of her big brother was something that Debbie was really looking forward to. She couldn't wait for a right good knees up with her family. No one could have known, however, that the sky blue gown that Debbie was having hemmed and pinned that afternoon would end up being the gown that she was buried in just days later. Debbie's plan had always been to attend the course, visit her family, and then head back up to Scotland. However, while she was at the management training course, another person there took a shine to Debbie, the manager of the Baker Street Sherlock Holmes Hotel. He was impressed by her professionalism and her knowledge of the hotel industry and offered her a job right there on the spot. The two agreed that the following afternoon, Debbie would visit the hotel and see what it was like, see if she would be a good fit. Of course, a job in London has its perks. She would be close to her family and school friends again, but she did have her life in Edinburgh, and was she ready to really be done with Scotland? She had a boyfriend, she had friends. How would she break the news to them? Despite her concerns, Debbie thought that what's the harm? She might as well go for it. And on the 23rd of March, her brother Gordon dropped her off at 2 p.m. at Pettswood Station, headed for London Victoria. The route Debbie took that day had several stops, so the London police had the hard task of trying to determine at which stop Debbie had met her killer. There's been a lot of unanswered questions regarding the CCTV footage taken that day from London Victoria, and I think the easiest way to say it is, was there CCTV in operation? Yes. Was it recording? No. Now, I know we're all sufficiently enraged at this fact, but in the 1980s, it was apparently common practice. In fact, several airports and train stations only had CCTV footage which would record in real time, which meant they had a security guard who would sit in an office and watch it happen as it happened. But we have to factor human error in this. If he got hungry or needed a pee-pee, there was things that he would miss that he would never be able to review again. That footage would be gone forever. As bizarre as it may seem, and much to the dismay of its passengers and employees, a popular Manchester train station, funnily enough also called Victoria, still had this system in operation in 2007. When it was finally exposed, they then had to replace it. But it just goes to show, doesn't it? So because of this archaic system, law enforcement would have to solely rely on eyewitness testimonies by tracking down the 700 plus visitors that had travelled through the station that day. And it wouldn't be easy. And bear in mind, guys, at this point, contactless payment wasn't a thing. In fact, the debit card wasn't put into production until 1987. I'm sure all my old school retail workers will remember when you had to take someone's credit card and literally trace it with a bit of charcoal. So for those of you who don't know, if you wanted to take card payment before contactless and chip and pin, you would have to place someone's card beneath a piece of tracing paper, yes, and then you would have this little swipe machine, which was essentially a bit of plastic with a piece of charcoal taped to the bottom of it, and you would trace the details on their card. You would keep the piece of paper and that would be your receipt. So really, when we think about it, law enforcement were relying on people being honest as to whether they were in the station that day, and a killer who's trying to hide his identity is not going to come forward unless he's one of those weird ones who likes the attention. You know the type.
I don't know the girls.
Pretty early on in the investigation, it was determined that Debbie's friends, family, her boyfriend, and the manager of the Baker Street Hotel that she was scheduled to meet were not involved in this case. It was determined that this was probably the act of a stranger. As the news of this crime and the fact that it was an unprovoked and random attack spread, the working women of London were in a panic, many arming themselves with rape whistles and small pocket knives. The UK media really fed into this storyline. Where was this demon in human form, and when would he strike again? With the national hysteria, soon came the eyewitness testimonies, but one stood out from the rest. A young female French au pair visiting the UK named Elaine Josseline. Nailed it. I'm just kidding. We all know I can't speak French, okay? Apart from, well, voulez-vous coucher avec moi?
You're just a whore.
Elaine was also a passenger on the 216 train. She was seated in the third carriage from the front, the one directly behind Debbie's. She said that her journey was pretty uneventful until they reached Brixton Station, only 8 minutes away from London Victoria. She said at this time she was shocked by a startling scream, a woman's scream, which continued on and off for around 2 minutes. She said that the woman would stop screaming and then it would start back up again, shortly before silence fell over the carriage. As a safety aspect, each of the carriages was fitted with an emergency lever, but despite hearing what she thought was a woman being sexually assaulted, Elaine said that she was too terrified to move and she sat on her seat and did nothing. This would be something that Elaine was seriously criticised for later down the line. Now, there's a few things I can understand. She's 18, she's young, maybe she was terrified. Maybe she had the fear that if the train was brought to a stop, that the killer could easily open the doors to carriage number 2 and pop right into her carriage and finish her off. But something I can't understand and which makes zero sense is that when the train finally pulled into London Victoria, this mousy, terrified au pair turns into G.I. Jane and starts chasing the killer through the station until she loses sight of him. Another factor that didn't make sense to investigators, and if I'm honest, it makes absolutely no sense to me, is the fact that Elaine was seated in carriage number 3, directly behind Debbie in carriage number 2. Then you had carriage number 1, and then where the driver sits at the front of the platform. So, in order to exit the train platform, Elaine would have had to have gotten out and walked past Debbie's carriage. So instead of checking the welfare of the attacked woman, she decided to chase down the attacker and not even peek in to make sure this woman was alive. Her description of the assailant was also pretty Agatha Christie-esque. She said this was a man in his 40s wearing a light coloured windbreaker jacket and a pair of grey trousers. She said he had reddish brown hair and, wait for it, a handlebar moustache and also a noticeable limp, which she saw when she was chasing him down the platform. Weirdly enough though, none of the other passengers of the 1416 train remember seeing this noticeable man with the limp. No. but they do see someone else. At Penge East Station, which was another stop on this route, a woman said that she saw a man getting off the train and then hopping back into another carriage, which she believed was Debbie's carriage number 2. This man was described as being around 30 years of age. He had a pale brown jacket and dirty, scruffy blonde hair. Another man was seen hurrying through the train station only 10 minutes after Debbie's train arrived at London Victoria. He was described as 5'5". He had long, ashy blonde hair and was seen to have had some deep scratch marks on his face. Because of the similarities in the description of the man with the scratches on his face and the man seen at Penge East Station, it is possible that these two men could be the same suspect. A final man was seen in the bathroom of the train station washing off a cut in the sink. However, it's believed that this isn't related to Debbie's crime because, one, this was hours after the fact. Law enforcement don't believe that this person would risk being cited by staying in the one place. Also, there was a friendly football match, which was far from friendly, between Holland and England in London that day, and it was said that the streets were lined with brawling football fans. So, we have 3 viable suspects, maybe even just 2, and an eyewitness who claimed she heard the dying woman's screams. But did she really? You see, Elaine never even came forward to law enforcement until days after Debbie's body was found. It does make everyone wonder, did she see anything or was she making the whole thing up? And if she was, have police essentially been chasing a man who doesn't exist? The only physical evidence discovered in this case was a few tiny drops of blood found at the scene where Debbie was murdered. But this was 1988 and DNA technology was an eager little baby back then. No one who was on the train that day claims to have seen Debbie after she got into the smoker's carriage. So it is possible that her killer at some point along the way in her journey got into the carriage with her and they were alone. If we're to go by Elaine's statement, it would suggest that Debbie was attacked somewhere between Brixton and London Victoria, which was a 6 to 8 minute journey. Many believe because of this snug timeline, the French au pair was mistaken. No one really thought that someone could possibly commit this kind of crime, change their clothes because the scene was a bloodbath. The murderer would have been covered in blood spatter, all within 6 to 8 minutes. It does seem unlikely, but it's not impossible. We have seen other cases where killers certainly push the boundaries of time. Take the case of Sally Ann Bowman. She was dropped off after a night out by her boyfriend, literally at the bottom of her driveway. So it would be a few seconds and she'd be in her front door. So her boyfriend, thinking she'd be safe, drove off. But those few seconds were all that stranger and murderer Mark Dixie needed to attack her in her very own street. Police believe that the most probable scenario is that her killer entered the train at Penge East Station. At this point, he began talking to Debbie, all the while concealing that large kitchen knife in the inside of his jacket. He started chatting, she dropped her guard and got friendly with him, which explains why she never pulled out her rape whistle and she never pulled the emergency lever in the carriage. He meticulously planned this crime by concealing his weapon on the inside of his jacket. He then hoped that on this quieter midday train service he would encounter a lone female travelling by herself. He knew he'd have more time between London Victoria and Brixton Station than any other stop along this route. So, as the train pulled away from Brixton Station, he struck. But what he hadn't bargained for was true crime fan Debbie's feisty nature, and she injured him in the attack. Fun fact, he was a rare blood type, which meant the law enforcement could narrow down their search. But regardless of a segment on the UK's favourite true crime show, Crime Watch and a £30,000 reward offered, we still don't know who this monster is. The case file slowly began to gather dust, and in 1995 the Linsley family faced fresh disappointment when the creation of the UK DNA database proved that the killer's DNA did not match any of the convicted criminals currently being held in the UK. However, in 2002, the case was reopened due to advances in DNA technology, which proved that at the time of the crime, the murderer was between 30 and 40 years old, and that he was a white male. With this new information, a special aired on The Tonight Show with Trevor McDonald on the 13th of September 2002. The investigation continued, and despite several promising leads, in 2014 law enforcement stated they were now hoping to find this person through the new technology of familial DNA. This was the same process which led to the capture of the Golden State Killer in 2018. Unfortunately, Marguerite Linsley will never see justice done for her daughter, as she passed away in 2013. Her father, Arthur, is extremely skeptical that we will ever know really what happened to Debbie. He said that within the first 6 months of the case, he knew we would never find the killer. How can someone disappear after committing a crime so violent? Can a savage and impulsive monster really just dissipate into obscurity? Many are skeptical about this, and for this reason they believe that her killer is now dead too. But what about past crimes? Criminal psychologists would say that this kind of violent offender would have shown red flags in their past prior to this. Why, if this was his first crime, did he feel so confident that he could commit such a brutal killing en route to a very busy train station with such a restricted time frame? Was it maybe because he'd done it before? This case is one that I have been digging into for months, and along the way I found a case with eerie similarities that has kept me up at night. The 1964 murder of 15-year-old Yvonne Laker, who was travelling from Southampton to Reading. On June 29th, 1964, 15-year-old Yvonne Laker was murdered on the train travelling from Southampton to Reading. Yvonne was travelling back to boarding school after spending some time with her family, and it's believed she was murdered somewhere between Southampton and Basingstoke. At 3:25, her body was discovered by a 12-year-old boy. Several on-train workers said they saw a suspicious male jumping from the moving train as soon as the emergency cord was pulled. There were several similarities in this case to that of Debbie Linsley's case. For example, their outfits. Debbie was wearing a full bright blue outfit and a black leather jacket, and Yvonne was wearing a long bright blue school dress. The style of the attack was similar. It was quick, it was frenzied, it was random. Much like in the murder of Debbie, the killer seemed to be very familiar with the route and waited until there was the biggest time gap between stops. Law enforcement do believe they've narrowed it down to the 48-minute journey between Winchester Station and Basingstoke Station, where the killer knew he'd be alone in the carriage with Yvonne for a considerable amount of time. However, unlike Debbie's case, someone was actually charged in this crime, a 26-year-old man named Derek Pryor. Derek was actually arrested on an unrelated car theft charge when he miraculously admitted to seeing the whole thing. He claimed that the only passengers on the train at that time were he and a dark-haired man. He said that he saw the man carrying an unconscious woman into the bathroom, and when he came out, Without the woman, he questioned him on where she was. To this, he was told to mind his own business. The man remembered seeing broken shards of glass around the train and thought nothing of it. Maybe just a drunk in the afternoon dropped his bottle of sherry. But it was determined that Yvonne had actually been struck on the back of the head with a bottle and then stabbed in the neck with the broken shards. No physical evidence was ever found linking Derek Pryor to the case, apart from a tiny glass shard that was found in his jacket pocket, something he said he had absolutely no knowledge of. A few different pieces of Derek's story didn't really add up. He said that after getting off the train, he'd gotten on another train and headed in the opposite direction. However, one of his friends from school said that he saw him still in Basingstoke at 7:30 p.m. He claimed to have travelled from Hook to Odingham via taxi, but Hook is quite a small place and none of the taxi drivers in the area ever admitted to picking up Derek Pryor. The owner of the Grapes pub in Basingstoke said that he witnessed Derek coming into the bar at around 1 p.m, 1:30 p.m. on the day of the murder, which would make it virtually impossible for him to be on the same train that Yvonne was travelling on. So it's possible he made the entire thing up. But this was the 1960s and, you know, corruption. So everyone wanted this case closed, and without any physical evidence at all, Derek Pryor was arrested and charged with the murder of Yvonne Laker. Eyewitness testimony would eventually set him free. A couple of on-train workers who had seen the man acting suspiciously and running from the train at Basingstoke both agreed that Derek Pryor was not that same man. Another woman who'd been on the train at that time said that she'd also seen the suspicious man running from the train, and yeah, it wasn't Derek Pryor. In fact, after hearing the details of this case, the jury were sceptical that Derek Pryor had even been on Yvonne's train at all that day. It was said that Derek was a man of lesser intelligence. I think we can all guess what they meant by that in the 1960s. So it is heavily hinted that he was coerced into saying that he was there that day. After only 6.5 hours of deliberation, the jury came back with a verdict of not guilty, and Derek Pryor was a free man. But if not him, then who? And would he strike again 24 years later? Both of these cases have their differing factors, but they both give off the energy of a thrill kill committed by an exhibitionist, where the thrill of getting caught for the murder is even more alluring than the act of killing itself. In the first case, again, we have the bottle that was brought with him to murder Yvonne. We have another lone female who was attacked, yet again, in the same style of closed carriage. There was no signs of sexual assault, which suggests that the killer yet again got off more on the violence of it all. A bag of items reportedly left behind by the killer in the first case were a cucumber, a lettuce, a half-eaten bag of crisps, and the wrapper to a loaf of bread, which was sold solely from a baker in the Midlands. This suggests that the killer was travelling up and down England on the train looking for his perfect victim. The similarities that we find in Debbie's case suggest that this time the killer was upping the ante. Take the brazenness of these crimes. The first time he attacks his victim in the security of a locked bathroom. But in Debbie's case, he just murders her right there in the open, inside the carriage. The time frame is much narrower in Debbie's case. In the first case, he has over 45 minutes to do what he wants, but in the case of Debbie, he's got between 6 and 8 minutes, almost as if he's daring someone to catch him when the train stops at London Victoria. The murder weapons themselves, we have a bottle of sherry, which can easily be explained away. But in the second case, it's much more risky. It's a kitchen knife concealed inside his jacket. If these crimes are connected, there's clearly one thing that the killer thought he could do better, which was his exit strategy. In Yvonne's case, he drew attention to himself by jumping from a moving train into a quiet train platform, whereas in Debbie's case, it was London Victoria. It was a busy platform and he walked away calmly from the murder scene. If we believe the testimony of Elaine, the au pair, then it would suggest that Debbie's killer was around 40 years old. This would also back up psychologists' idea that this was not the first crime he had committed in a setting like this. All theories aside, neither Debbie or Yvonne's killers have ever been found. And even though it may not seem important, someone will definitely have a memory, no matter how hidden away, from that day. Maybe he came home with a scratch on his face or an unexplained bruise on his arm. This man who never has nosebleeds all of a sudden has a few red dots on his shirt sleeve. Did your dad not arrive on time that day to pick you up, with no explanation as to why? These tiny pieces could be the perfect fit to give the Linsley and the Laker families the answer that they need. After the death of Debbie Linsley, British Rail started phasing out the kind of carriages that had been putting women at risk for years. To her family, Deborah Linsley will always be known as simply Debbie, or to her mother, her treasure. But to us here who've only heard her story through urban legends or a quiet whisper on a school playground, she will always be known as the girl on the train. I hope you guys enjoyed this week's episode. If you did, please give it a big thumbs up. For me, it really helps my wee channel. If you would like to follow me, not home or on a train, you can do on Instagram at Megan TrueCrime. I also have TikTok at Megan.TrueCrime, and I have Twitter, I've got all three of them, at Megan TrueCrime. I love you all so much. I'm so thankful each and every day for every one of you. If I don't say it enough, I'm so sorry, because I think you're all absolute angels. So remember to take care of yourselves mentally and physically. I love you all. So lock your doors, don't talk to strangers, and if you're travelling by rail, make sure that you follow my mum's advice and always sit in the carriage right behind the driver. See ya!